In terms of innovation and style, Boris Kaufman has to be very, very highly placed in the pantheon of cinematographers. Certainly, to most cinematographers today, he's a name that's known, a name that's respected, but whose work is not really individualized. Boris Kaufman was the youngest of three brothers. The other two brothers were filmmakers as well, cinematographers, directors. The oldest one was Dennis Kaufman, who was born probably about 1895, I think, and he adopted in the Soviet era the name Dziga Vertov, and was a theoretician and director, cinematographer. Did a very famous film from 1929 called Man with a Movie Camera, which was photographed by the other brother, Mikhail, who was the middle brother, who was born, I think, just a couple of years after Dennis. There's some question when Boris, the youngest son, was born. If he was born when some people say he was, then all three sons were born within like 18 months of each other. But he may have been born in 1906. All of them in Białystok, Poland, which at the time was politically aligned or possessed by Russia. And then when the First World War broke out, and I guess Germany invaded, the family moved to Russia. And the two older brothers stayed, became very involved with the beginning of the Soviet-era film industry, became filmmakers and theoreticians and taught. And Boris ended up being sent to Paris, and he studied at the Sorbonne. He did maintain contact with his brothers, who were very much in the sort of ferment of Soviet-era experimental filmmaking during the 20s. Certainly he must have been seeing a lot of those films at that time. The early Soviet era was a period of an incredible technical and aesthetic experimentation. The medium was really new, and because it was silent, the images had to carry, obviously, not just the visual, but the dramatic weight. And so it was filmmaking for a brief several decades was sort of freed from any sense of having to have strict narrative dialogue. And the Soviets, and certainly the German expressionists, but probably preeminently the Soviet filmmakers of the 20s sort of embraced that nonverbal aesthetic. Preeminent among them, of course, were Pudovkin and Eisenstein. And Eisenstein's first real international film was Battleship Potemkin from 1925, and it has a lot of visual techniques, compositions, a selection of camera angles that are very much part of that zeitgeist that were also being taught at the Bauhaus in Germany. Boris Kaufman grew up in that ambience, as did Jean Vigo. Boris Kaufman started his career in France, and he did either 3 or 4 films with Jean Vigo, who died very young in 1934 at the age of 29. And they were very experimental films. They were done, certainly the first one, Apropos de Nice, a silent film, was done very much in that sort of almost Soviet-era German expressionist experimental style, camera style, with not a strict narrative. It was an impressionistic kind of film. Vigo was spending a lot of time along the Promenade des Anglais, along the beachfront there, and looking at the vacation people, the sort of sense of indulgence and entitlement and decadence that they represented. And Vigo came from a very strong leftist political tradition. His father was perhaps an actual, anarchist, and was in jail. He had changed his name. He had a politicized name, and he died under mysterious circumstances in prison when Vigo was still quite young. But Vigo was very much privy to and heir to that sort of leftist socialist, tradition from his father, and that permeates the whole content of Apropos de Nice. And Kaufman obviously had to have been in a sympathetic world of that. I don't know much about Kaufman's actual politics, but both of his brothers were, political filmmakers in the Soviet Union at the same time. So, it was very much in the air, of course, at the time around the world. And the title card for Apropos de Nice, after the title card, lists both Kaufman and Jean Vigo as co-filmmakers. It's a shared card, and the only other time I can think of ever having done that was when Orson Welles shared his card with Greg Toland for Citizen Kane. So it's sort of a unique thing, and it's very startling when you see it. So it's really a collaboration between the two. In 1927, I think it was, Mikhail came to Paris to visit Boris and brought with him a small camera called a Kinamo camera, which was one of the first very small sort of handheld portable cameras. It was originally manufactured, I think, in 1921 or 22 as a hand crank camera. And then a few years later, by 1925, I think they'd put in a spring, a wound spring. And it was very unusual in that it was extremely lightweight. It was only about 6 inches high. And it didn't even really look like a camera. It looked like a little leather box. And so it was very easy to sort of just hold it in your hand and shoot. And people wouldn't be aware that you were actually using a camera. So Kaufman had this small camera, and he and Vigo were able to go out on the promenade in Nice and basically shoot dozens and dozens of people without being noticed. And that little camera that they had, the Kinamo camera, was really unique in that it did not have to be threaded. You did not take a roll of film and thread it through, the sprockets and into the gate and everything. You'd open it up, plug the thing in, and I think it was like a 35-meter cassette. And you could just close it up and shoot, and then reload it. Even you could put another cassette in the open light. You didn't have to go into a dark room. So they were able to continue shooting. Not only was the camera basically invisible, but they could reload it and keep shooting, when they found something that was very interesting. And when you look at Apropos de Nice, it's startling how close the camera is to a lot of these people. I mean, it was basically shot handheld. They couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 meters away from some of the people they were shooting. That sense of being so close to the subject is something that, it seems to me, is not just there from the beginning in Kaufman's work, but it's all the way through. And if you look at just the way he used close-ups in the later films, even as late as, say, The Fugitive kind or in Long Day's Journey, but particularly in 12 Angry Men, when you get into the intense close-ups, there is, for me, a kind of hearkening back or an evocation of the way he used the camera at the very beginning of his career. You see it in Apropos de Nice, you see it a little bit in Zero de Conduite, but you see it in the feature, you see it in Lot et Lot. I mean, there are scenes in Lot et Lot where you feel the camera is right on top of Dita Parlo and Michel Simon. The scene in the barge in Michel Simon's room where he's showing her all of the artifacts that he's collected from around the world. The camera is literally right on top of them. Obviously it was a set. There's no way they could have got a camera and lights in there. That was part of the set that they did. But it feels, in terms of its sense of a claustrophobic space and the way the camera was used and the kind of stuffed, tight compositions in there, that you are in an actual space. And juxtaposed to it is a sense of the wider space. The exterior scenes in that very severe winter with the short days and the low light. There's that magic hour nighttime sequence in the fog when Dita Parlo, still in her wedding dress, is walking along the barge like, a visionary angel or something. Incredibly poetic. And there are images like that all the way through the film. I mean, they were, that barge was out on the canals and the waterways and the Seine in that very severe winter, and you see a lot of traffic, a sense of changing light and changing, space. It almost has a documentary feel. And that sense of light and dark is a strong element all the way through Kaufman's work. You see it even in something as a documentary like À propos de Nice. Of course, it's much stronger by the time you get to Zero de Conduite, which is, a fictional film, and has a lot of interiors where the lighting, of course, was able to be controlled a lot more. Very bold. It is sort of an indication, I think, of just how meticulous, even at that early a point, Kaufman was. To place the lights as carefully as he did, and lighting such specific small areas, even in that film, was something that was not generally done. I mean, a lot of the European films, especially of that time, had a more general kind of lighting. You look at most of the Renoir films from the early sound period, and they're not nearly that dramatic. So I think that Kaufman, even from very early on, was somewhat anomalous. When Vigo died, he was sort of a very promising director, and Kaufman, even though he had worked on a few documentaries before Vigo, he kind of got his teeth, with Vigo. And when Vigo died in October of 1934, I think Kaufman, still very young, was cast adrift, and he righted himself very quickly. And throughout the 30s, he worked with a large number of French feature film directors, and had what looked to be like a very major career in the French film industry. When the war broke out, he was drafted, and he served briefly with the French army until France surrendered, and he somehow escaped. I don't know how, but he somehow got himself to Canada. And for a brief period of time, he worked in Canada for the Film Board, doing documentaries under John Grierson. And sometime in 1942, he actually came to the United States, and he settled in New York. And he started making a number of documentaries and shorts in New York, some of which were, I think, wartime propaganda films. In 1947, he did a very highly esteemed, almost feature-length film for the United States Information Service called Journey into Medicine. And on the basis of that and a couple of other films, he established, I think, some sort of, legitimate credits in the New York filmmaking system, and eventually that led him to Elia Kazan. It's my understanding that when Boris Kaufman met with Kazan, he was able to show him some of his documentary work, which obviously, especially a film like Journey into Medicine, which I do think that Kazan saw, shows great sophistication in its lighting, and yet it has a documentary reality to it. And I think that combination of documentary reality and controlled stylization and lighting technique appealed to him very, very much.
The lack of proper medical care when they were young.
He wanted him to see La de Lant, but there was no print available in the United States. And it's too bad in a way, because what could have been a more perfect bridge, for Kaufman between, a film that takes place on a barge on the waterways, and then Hoboken, New Jersey on the docks and on the waterfront. I mean, there's a thread. There is a thread of water and boats, linking the two in a very beautiful way. And I am merely supposing this, but my own sense is that some of the sense of space and the sense of poetry that is in La de Lant and the controlled use of light percolates through into On the Waterfront. And there's a certain irony to the fact that he actually hired Kaufman, because Kaufman was the youngest of three brothers, the other two of whom were, communists living and working in Soviet Russia at a period when, in the American film industry, the House Un-American Affairs Committee was attempting to purge Hollywood. And the irony, of course, is that one of the friendly witnesses to the committee was Elia Kazan. And, he had to deal with that for the rest of his career, even up to when he got the honorary Academy Award. So there's a tremendous irony that it was a confirmed anti-communist, a testified anti-communist, who hired this Polish-Russian cinematographer who must have been on the FBI's radar anyway, because of his two brothers, living in New York, and yet he hired him. I mean, there's sort of a delicious aspect to it that it's kind of like Nixon going to China. It took somebody like Kazan to give an outsider like Boris Kaufman the ability to jump into the American feature film mainstream. And jump in he did. It turned out that was his first American studio feature film on the waterfront. And he got a nomination and subsequently got an Academy Award for that. He stayed in New York. As far as I know, he never actually came to Hollywood. He never shot a film outside of New York. Even The Fugitive Kind, which nominally takes place in Mississippi, was shot, very close to New York City. He was a real New Yorker. He lived in the Village. He lived on West 9th Street. And he had an accent. From what I've been told by several actors who have worked with him, he was very quiet, methodical. He was not a self-promoter. He was very focused on his work, obviously. There's a very strong European aesthetic in his work, which has nothing to do with the American studio tradition. In other words, we think of American cinematography from the 30s, 40s as having a certain style. There's a certain MGM style, a Warner Brothers grittier style, a kind of, romantic sort of very gauzy style. We think of Paramount films during the 30s, a lot of them. And there were certain American cameramen who were under contract to specific studios during those days, like Shamroy had a long-term contract with 20th Century Fox. And there were sort of house styles, not just in terms of the cinematography, but in terms of costumes, in terms of subject matter even. And Kaufman was totally outside that world. So Boris Kaufman sort of worked within his own sort of very small and very intense pressure cooker. And that pressure cooker had a lot to do with intense theatrical drama that either came directly from theater pieces or had a kind of theatrical quality to them. For example, Baby Doll was an original screenplay that Tennessee Williams did, but the film itself feels like a theater piece. In terms of just the formality of the dialogue. It's a lower depths kind of environment, like Fugitive Kind, but it has its own kind of like dark, down and out poetry to it. He photographed 7 films for Sidney Lumet and 3 films for Elia Kazan. And that constitutes a large percentage of his known body of work. So it was a very sort of tightly, kind of a nuclear kind of environment that he worked in. It was very compact and very tight and very intense. And I can't think of another cinematographer working in American mainstream films that was that specific in terms of the kind of films he did, the nature of the films, and then also in terms of the physical, aesthetic way that he worked with lighting and the use of the camera. It was very, very individual. The sense of physical space, streets, buildings, and everything, I think have always been very important to the way Kaufman worked. In the New York films, for example, what we normally think of as establishing shots of buildings, skylines, and things like that, they're not normal shots. They're intensely present and dramatic. Hot highlights and dark shadows, real chiaroscuro and everything. The city feels almost like a character. That is something that I think Kaufman did everywhere. At the beginning of 12 Angry Men, the few opening shots, the exterior establishing shot, of the court building, the shot from inside, coming from the rotunda up to the walkway and with people crossing, and then panning over and going down the hallway to the jury room. I mean, it seems like, well, it's sort of throwaway, but it's really not, because there's a tremendous sense of animation. And in 12 Angry Men, when you get inside the jury room, the opening shot itself is absolutely startling. Now, part of it is very theatrical in terms of the staging. You're introduced to all of the characters, but the way the camera is used to do that and the moves that happen are really extraordinary. A lot of what we see in 12 Angry Men that I think embodies Kaufman's style is in the compositions more than the lighting. When they come into the jury room, which is 6.5 minutes long, it's a high angle across a fan at one end of the room. Jack Warden comes in and he tries to turn on the fan. And then as he walks away, the fan won't turn on. The camera booms down and starts to move down the table. And during the course of the next 5.5 minutes, it moves basically through most of the room back and forth. And we are introduced to different groups of the jurors. And we also get a strong sense right away that Henry Fonda is the one character that seems to be outside. He immediately goes to the window and he stands there. It's an amazing shot. It has very tight compositions. A lot of the moves are not terribly complicated moves, but they're all very meaningful. And I think that shot, even though the mise en scène, the choreography, the actors obviously was something Lumet, created, I think there was a real dialogue between him and Kaufman about how to do that. As we go through the film and we see an increasing use of 2 shots, tightly composed 4 shots, a variety of angles down the length of the table where we see 6 and 8 people stacked up. I think those are really Kaufman's compositions. I mean, Lumet coming out of TV and working on a small screen and working with multiple cameras where you could not get one camera in and get those kind of closely observed shots. And we know from several decades' work that that's exactly the kind of presence that Kaufman created. I think that's very much Kaufman's contribution. And then as we get toward the later part of the film, and where it's a little bit darker, and we get slightly more dramatic lighting on the actors, nothing like what he did before, and certainly nothing like what he was doing after in Fugitive Kind. But it has a definite sort of hints that it's Kaufman's lighting. As you go through the movie and it gets more and more jurors start to vote for acquittal, and it gets later in the day, and then the rain comes in and they turn the light on. It does have an evolution in the lighting style. The walls become darker, the shadows become a little bit stronger. The close-ups, especially the very tight close-ups when you get in toward the end, when there's some very tight close-ups with wide-angle lenses, and the lighting has sort of a break across the forehead, where you have a little shadow there, and the backgrounds tend to fall off a little bit more. There is a progression in the lighting style, but it's not much. And I think one of the reasons that it didn't evolve more is because I think probably Lumet, being his first film, probably didn't have the courage to let Kaufman do that. This pure supposition on my part, but on the basis of Kaufman's work before and after, I would say that is not the choice he would have made. I think that Lumet wanted the jury room to look much more open.
Take 15 seconds. Now we can spare that, see?
One of the things that cinematographers always try to avoid, unless they're trying to make a satiric comment, is to use wide-angle lenses for close-ups and medium shots because of the distortion, and especially back in the 50s when the lenses were not designed by computers yet, and they tended to have more sort of aberrations perspective and chromatic aberrations already built in, it was very dangerous to use a wider angle lens for a close-up. And yet Kaufman seemed to, walk that razor edge between it being arresting and making you feel very present with the shot and it sort of putting you off.
Say something!
I'm absolutely convinced that the choice of lenses and the kind of configuration of those shots very much must have been what Kaufman was doing. I think he made those choices. In other interviews, Lumet, later in his life, talks about having chosen lenses, and he felt that he knew lenses from the TV days and everything. And he talks about using, longer lenses for close-up and selective depth of field and things like that. But that is actually not what you are seeing at all in 12 Angry Men. You're seeing absolutely the converse of that. You are actually seeing wide-angle lenses in close with a deep focus behind them. I mean, it's something that Toland did and George Barnes did, decades before. But even there, it was done differently. I mean, you look, 12 Angry Men, isn't it? It's the use of the single shots and even two shots, a lot of times there, is so strange. I mean, it's not the way you would think that a Hollywood film would be photographed at that time. It's not the conventional sort of compressed perspective. And it kind of throws you into that moment, into being with that actor. You certainly see it all the way through The Fugitive Kind. The close-ups of Anna Magnani and of Brando in there. He uses a little diffusion on her sometimes, you cut and you see just a slight sense of diffusion, but they're not flattering long lens portrait lenses that he used. The camera's in very close to them. Fugitive Kind is such a standalone film. I can't think of anything else like it in sort of the canon of American studio films. And I think it's one reason why it failed so miserably at the time of the release. I think it was so against the tenor of the times that people did not know what to make of it. The lighting, when Brando comes into the town in his kind of beat-up jalopy and it's raining, and he turns a corner and there's this unbelievable strong backlight that's behind a tree or something. You see shafts of this light penetrating through the rain and the fog. It literally is, the Fugitive Kind was based on Tennessee Williams' play Orpheus Descending. And I mean, literally, when you first see Brando coming in here in that car, and it's like he's descending into an inferno inside that car. And it's that one shot already kind of puts you inside the space of the film. Fugitive Kind seems to have real physical space. The cars, the general store, so much of it looks and feels like a gritty, sort of small southern space. But none of it is photographed in a way that looks anything other than incredibly stylized. I think there is an evolution in Boris Kaufman's lighting, particularly. I mean, the compositions, there's, very dramatic compositions, the kind we find all the way through his career. But the lighting has evolved from film to film to the most refined and specific kind of use of almost dots of light. I mean, some of the night scenes, a character, Brando, will move 2 or 3 inches, or Magnani will move 2 or 3 inches out of one light into another light. And even some of the close-ups that are static, there is such a small nimbus of light around the face. The forehead, the hair will be dark, the neckline will be dark, or if there's light there, there'll be a hard bar shadow cut through it. The back walls will have a hard, almost film noir cut through them. Very controlled lighting that you would think would make it seem so artificial. But again, and this is what Kaufman says he wants to do, he wants to get inside the characters and inside the emotional dynamic.
To go on leaving.
One of the sort of abiding truths, I think, in the work of Boris Kaufman is you never feel he was doing any kind of a trick, either in the lighting, the composition, the camera movement. It was all to serve what he felt was the emotional state of the film. And because these characters are sort of basically so overheated and so dramatic and urgent in their needs, that the lighting serves that. I mean, if the lighting had been more realistic, if the lighting had been more documentary, if the day scenes in the store even had actually had window light coming in so you felt the outside. You never feel the outside light coming in that store. I mean, obviously it was a set, but it's lit from inside, you know, there's nothing real about it. And that was a very brave choice to have done through the film. I mean, there are people that have said that Boris Kaufman worked very slowly. But he's also been defended by Kazan, I think, saying, you know, that it takes a long time to write poetry. And as a cinematographer, when I look at the lighting in The Fugitive Kind and I see how specific it was and how many small lights he used, every light, whether it's a big light or a small light, has to be set and controlled, and it takes time. And if you're lighting with 2 lights or 3 lights, fairly large lights, and you cut them in a certain way to control them a little bit, that's working a lot faster than if you're working with 15 or 20 or 25 lights. And I think in a lot of these scenes, Kaufman was working with dozens of lights. Just small little things that were snooted just to get a little, just a small, you know, just a small nimbus of light. And there are a couple of scenes where he is so in control of the light and essentially wants the light to make such a contribution that he actually changes the light within the shot. And Lumet has talked about that in an interview. And the first time is the night that Brando has come back from the juke joint, and there are lights on in the store, but there's a lot of darkness, a lot of shadow, and very controlled light. There's a hard cross light on a Magnani. You know, a lot of times it's just a little nimbus of circle of light. Other times it's a cross light, and it changes. Even within the scene, her key light and Brando's key light will change, not dimming from one light to another, but as you change the angles, instead of maintaining a consistent key, the key itself will change, which is a very deliberate device, obviously, that Kaufman is doing. And there's a scene as Brando is talking to her in this long scene where he's standing up against, behind him, it's a low angle, and there's a wall behind there with windows. And Brando starts to tell the story about what his life is like, that he's really a bird that can't land. And it's a beautiful Tennessee Williams sort of monologue, which could have been absolutely deadly. But within the shot, as you're watching it, the light starts to go out on Brando and his face gets darker, and the glass from behind, the walls behind him get darker as well, but the glass starts to light, and there's light coming through the glass, and then a light comes up on Brando's face. It's totally unreal, you know. And this was obviously something, and Lumet admits that he didn't know that Kaufman was going to do this. This was something Kaufman had planned. And when Lumet expressed certain anxiety about it, he said, we're going to do it again. And he wouldn't tell Lumet exactly when he did it, but later, toward the end of the film, when there's a reverse light change on her, where she started in the dark, and the light comes up on her, and the wall behind her slowly gets to be lit. And at first you think maybe it's just, you know, a street light effect, a headlight effect from a car that's passing or something. No, it's just a light change that he dimmed up in the shot. And those are 2 of the ones that Lumet talks about. There are other smaller ones that are more subtle, I think, throughout the film. I mean, I think that there are a lot of dimming effects that are going on all the way through the film. Vittorio Storaro talks a lot about using dimmer boards and doing light dimming effects as the camera moves around. Well, Kaufman was doing them in Fugitive Kind within the shot without changing the axis or the angle, and you can actually see them. They're very small changes.
I took nobody with me, not a soul.
I think looking at it now, there is such an integration. I think the cinematography, the performances, the absolute poetry in the screenplay itself are all of a piece. It seems to me a film that is as bold and as daring in everything that it does as The Fugitive Kind is really ripe for reevaluation. For me as a cinematographer, and I think for any cinematographer that is discovering Kaufman, and I think in a way he is just now really starting to be discovered as we're getting very high quality remastered DVDs of some of his work. It's earlier versions of it have suffered visually. Now we're actually seeing how strong, how beautiful and poetic the work is. I think he is standing out in a very individual way as an artist. And the work still seems so fresh and so new. It's so different than what other cinematographers were doing at the same time. And I think one of the reasons it's so individual is obviously because of who he was, his character as a human being, I think his aesthetic training, obviously, but that he was not part of, what can I say, he was an outsider. I think he was even an outsider in France. I mean, he came from Poland and grew up a little bit in Russia. He went to France as a young man. He worked there for, 12 or 15 years, became a war refugee, was in Canada. He came to the United States, struggled in New York for a number of years. I don't know that he was sort of a man without a country in an odd way. And I think it helped prepare the ground, or it was fertile soil for him to have a very specific and a very individual aesthetic. He wasn't part of a group or part of a larger body like a lot of the Hollywood or even some of the New York cinematographers were. I think in a lot of ways he was sort of a world unto himself.